You think you can still shoot that thing? The laughter came first. Loud, unrestrained. The kind of laughter that rolled across a firing range when a group of young Marines believed they had just found the day's entertainment. The late afternoon sun hung low over Camp Pendleton, painting the distant hills in shades of gold and bronze while heat shimmered above the rifle lanes like invisible waves. A line of Marines stood near the firing positions, their uniforms crisp, their confidence even sharper. Several of them turned toward the old man, standing quietly near the equipment rack. He looked completely out of place. Jack Callahan was 82 years old. His gray hair disappeared beneath a weathered ball cap. His faded field jacket looked older than most of the Marines laughing at him. The elbows were worn smooth from years of use, and the fabric carried the look of something that had traveled farther than any modern uniform ever could. Yet none of that seemed to bother him. He simply stood there with both hands resting lightly at his sides, his pale blue eyes scanning the range, as if he were studying something nobody else could see. Sergeant Tyler Brooks stepped forward, still grinning. At 27, Brooks was respected throughout the battalion as one of the best marksmen on base. He carried himself with the easy swagger of someone who had spent years being told he was exceptional. "Sir," he said, drawing out the word just enough to make the sarcasm obvious. "The museum is down the road. This is an active Marine rifle range." More laughter followed. A few Marines nudged each other. One pulled out his phone. Another folded his arms and waited for the old man to leave. Jack didn't react. The wind shifted slightly across the valley, rustling the dry brush beyond the targets. Range flags fluttered in different directions. Some snapped sharply. Others barely moved at all. Jack watched them for a moment before finally speaking. His voice was calm and gravelly, worn by age but steady. "I'd like to borrow a rifle." For a second there was silence. Then the laughter exploded again, louder than before. One Marine nearly doubled over. Another shook his head in disbelief. Brooks let out a short bark of amusement and looked around at his men as if to confirm they had all heard the same thing. "A rifle?" he asked. "You serious?" Jack nodded once. "Just for a minute." Brooks rubbed his jaw and stared at him. The old man wasn't smiling. He wasn't joking. Somehow that made the situation even funnier to the younger Marines. "What exactly are you planning to do with a rifle?" Brooks asked. "Show us how they did it back in World War II." More laughter swept through the firing line. Jack remained perfectly still. His eyes drifted toward the distant targets nearly 1,800 yards away. The steel silhouettes were tiny specks against the rugged California landscape. Most people could barely see them without optics. Brooks followed his gaze and smirked. An idea was beginning to form. The kind of idea young men often mistake for harmless fun. Around them, the afternoon range continued its steady rhythm. Brass casings glinted on the concrete. The smell of gun oil lingered in the warm air. Somewhere behind the observation tower, a helicopter crossed the horizon. But attention had shifted entirely toward the old veteran standing alone before a crowd that had already decided exactly who he was. Brooks pointed toward the distant steel target and grinned. "Tell you what, old-timer," he said. "If you think you've still got it, maybe we'll let you prove it." Jack looked at him quietly. The Marines leaned forward, eager to see what happened next. None of them noticed the faded patch partially hidden beneath the fold of Jack's weathered jacket. None of them recognized the symbol stitched into its worn threads. And none of them had the slightest idea that before this day was over, a four-star general would see that patch and bring the entire range to a standstill. The grin on Sergeant Tyler Brooks's face widened as he looked from the old man to the distant target line. The challenge had started as a joke, but now the entire firing range seemed to be leaning into it. Marines drifted closer from neighboring lanes. Conversations faded. Even a pair of range safety officers paused near the observation platform to see what was causing the commotion. The warm California air carried the smell of sun-baked concrete and dry grass, while heat waves danced above the valley floor. Jack Callahan stood unmoving in the center of it all. He looked less like a man preparing for a challenge and more like someone waiting for a bus. Brooks shook his head and laughed softly. "You know what? Let us make this interesting." He pointed toward the smallest steel silhouette visible through the haze. 1,800 yards. Most shooters here have not touched it all day. Several Marines nodded. That much was true. The target had become a source of frustration since morning. Wind conditions across the valley had shifted constantly. Advanced optics helped, but the range seemed determined to humble everyone who stepped behind a rifle. Brooks folded his arms. "Hit that target, and I will personally buy your dinner." More laughter followed. One Marine shouted that they should buy the old man breakfast too, because he would still be there tomorrow trying to make the shot. Another joked that they should issue him binoculars first. Jack listened without reacting. His gaze remained fixed on the distant terrain. The ridgeline, the shallow ravine to the left, the cluster of rocks near the halfway point. Details most people ignored. Brooks noticed the silence and mistook it for hesitation. "Changed your mind?" he asked. "No," Jack replied. "I was just looking." The answer somehow made the younger Marines laugh harder. Brooks gestured toward a rack near the firing line. "Fine. Pick one." Jack walked forward slowly. Every eye followed him. Rows of modern rifles rested neatly on the rack, each equipped with high-end optics and accessories worth thousands of dollars. He barely glanced at them. Instead, his attention settled on an older rifle positioned near the end. The finish showed signs of age. The stock carried small marks earned through years of use. Jack stopped in front of it. For the first time, something almost resembling recognition crossed his face. Brooks noticed immediately. "That one?" he asked. "You sure?" Jack nodded once. "That one." A few Marines exchanged amused looks. Brooks reached over and lifted the rifle from the rack. "Interesting choice." He handed it over with exaggerated care, as if presenting a fragile artifact. "Try not to break a hip carrying it." The crowd chuckled again. Jack accepted the rifle with steady hands. The moment his fingers touched the stock, the noise around him seemed to disappear. The laughter, the comments, the amusement, none of it mattered. His thumb brushed across a small worn section near the rear of the stock. The wood was smooth there, polished by years of handling. For a brief moment, he simply stood still, studying it. Lance Corporal Ethan Hayes watched from several yards away. Unlike the others, he was not laughing anymore. Something about the old man felt wrong. Not threatening, not dramatic, just wrong in a way he could not explain. Most civilians looked uncomfortable around military equipment. Most visitors tried too hard to impress. Jack Callahan did neither. He carried the rifle as though it belonged exactly where it was. Hayes frowned slightly. Then he noticed something else. As Jack adjusted the faded field jacket, part of an old patch became visible beneath the fold of the fabric. It was weathered almost beyond recognition. Most people would have dismissed it immediately. Hayes could not. Something about the symbol tugged at a distant memory. Before he could place it, Sergeant Brooks stepped closer and smiled. "All right, old-timer," he announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Let us see what you have got." Around them, Marines gathered tighter along the firing line, completely unaware that the small patch hidden beneath Jack's jacket was about to become the most important thing on the entire base. Jack Callahan stepped to the firing position, his hands steady on the aged rifle, the stock fitting perfectly against his shoulder as though it had been made for him alone. The Marines around him leaned forward, eyes wide, smirks fading slightly as they began to sense a difference in the air. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the concrete range, glinting off the steel targets that seemed impossibly distant. Jack adjusted his stance, subtle movements, almost imperceptible, yet precise. He squinted along the barrel, aligning sight with target, feeling the subtle gusts rolling across the valley floor. The mirage above the distant ridgeline shimmered, and he noted the tiny swaying of the range flags, the way the sunlight caught the edges of rocks, the direction of shadows across the valley. All of it spoke to him as if the range were alive and communicating, a language he had known for decades. Sergeant Tyler Brooks watched closely, shifting from foot to foot, his laughter long gone, replaced by a tense curiosity. Lance Corporal Ethan Hayes felt it too, that quiet, almost imperceptible sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. The wind shifted again. Jack exhaled softly, aligning himself, and then he squeezed the trigger. The sound was controlled, deliberate, echoing along the range. The bullet, precise and silent in its flight, struck the steel target dead center. A ripple of disbelief moved through the Marines. Some held their mouths open. Others blinked rapidly, unsure if their eyes were deceiving them. Brooks stepped back slightly, shaking his head, a frown creasing his forehead. Jack did not celebrate. He merely adjusted his stance again, scanning the distance, analyzing the angle of sunlight and the drift of the wind, calculating, observing, preparing. A second shot followed, this one even more precise, tracing the same flight path, landing squarely on the center of a second target farther down the line. Whispers spread among the gathered Marines, some shaking their heads in awe, others exchanging stunned glances. Hayes noticed the way Brooks's hands tensed, fingers tightening around the metal of a modern rifle that now felt almost foreign. Jack lowered the rifle slightly, eyes flicking toward the partially visible patch on his jacket, the one faded insignia that carried decades of unspoken history. The patch had survived years of wear, campaigns, and storms, yet it remained unmistakable to those who knew its significance. Hayes could see it clearly now, recognition dawning. A memory sparked, a story half-remembered from briefings and historical accounts. Sergeant Brooks shifted uneasily, now realizing that the quiet veteran they had mocked carried more history, more experience, than any of them could imagine. The laughter that had filled the air was gone, replaced by a tension that was palpable, a respect forming in real time as the range seemed to collectively hold its breath. Jack did not smile, did not speak, but the weight of his presence filled the space. Every Marine within view of him felt the shift, a subtle acknowledgement that they were witnessing someone who had truly lived, who had mastered the environment, the weapon, and himself. The afternoon heat continued to rise, yet there was a coolness in the collective recognition of the veterans around the range. Hayes could barely contain the urge to step forward, to validate what he was seeing, but he waited, knowing this moment would unfold exactly as it needed to. Jack adjusted his grip one final time, scanning the line of targets, the flags, the distance markers, as if reading the subtle cues of a world older than the technology surrounding him. And all the while, the old patch peeked out from under the jacket, a quiet testament to a past that had never been forgotten, a story about to be fully revealed. For several long seconds nobody spoke. The distant steel targets stood motionless beneath the fading California sun while a strange silence settled across the range. The old man lowered the rifle and carefully handed it back as though it deserved respect. Sergeant Tyler Brooks accepted it automatically, still trying to process what he had just witnessed. Around him, Marines exchanged uncertain looks. The jokes had disappeared, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that they might have misjudged the situation. Jack adjusted his faded jacket and turned slightly toward the equipment rack. That was when one of the younger Marines noticed the patch more clearly. "Hold on," he said. "What is that thing?" Several heads turned. The worn patch had slipped fully into view beneath the jacket fold. Time had faded most of its colors. The stitching was frayed. The edges looked as though they had survived decades of weather and travel. Yet the symbol at its center remained visible. The Marine stepped closer. "I have never seen that unit before." Another Marine leaned in. "Probably some surplus store souvenir." A few chuckles returned. Not as confident as before, but enough to break the tension. Sergeant Brooks glanced down at the patch. "You buy that at a military convention?" he asked. "Looks older than the rifle." More laughter followed. Jack said nothing. He simply rested one hand against the jacket as though protecting something precious. Brooks noticed the movement and smirked. "Come on. What is the story?" He reached forward before thinking. His finger lightly touched the edge of the patch. The reaction was immediate. Not anger, not surprise. Something deeper crossed Jack's face. His eyes drifted beyond the firing range, beyond the hills, beyond the afternoon sunlight. For a brief moment, he was no longer standing among young Marines in Southern California. The smell of dry grass vanished. In its place came the memory of damp air and endless rain. Thick clouds hung low above distant mountains. A much younger Jack sat beneath a canvas shelter illuminated by a single dim lantern. 5 exhausted men surrounded him. Their uniforms were worn. Their faces carried the weight of months spent far from home. Nobody spoke much that night. They did not need to. One of the men held the unfinished patch in his hands. Another carefully threaded a needle through the fabric. Every stitch carried meaning. Every line represented a promise. Not rank, not recognition, not awards. A reminder that no matter where life carried them afterward, they would remember those who stood beside them when nobody else could. The final stitch was completed just before dawn. The patch passed from hand to hand. Quiet nods replaced speeches. Nobody imagined that decades later only one of them would still be wearing it. The memory faded slowly. The range returned. The warm California wind touched his face once more. Marines stood around him waiting for an answer. Jack looked down at the patch. His expression remained calm. "It is just an old patch," he said softly. "Nothing special." But Lance Corporal Ethan Hayes knew that was not true. The symbol had finally connected with the memory buried in the back of his mind. He had seen it before. Not on a uniform. Not in a museum. In a restricted historical briefing during advanced training. His pulse quickened. He looked from the patch to Jack and back again. Then he quietly stepped away from the group and reached for his phone. Hayes moved several yards away from the gathering crowd before stopping near the edge of the observation area. His heart was beating faster now. The symbol on that patch refused to leave his mind. He opened a military reference application on his phone and began searching through archived unit insignia. Around him, the range continued to buzz with low conversation as Marines debated what they had just witnessed. Most were still focused on the impossible accuracy of the old man's shots. Hayes was focused on something else entirely. Meanwhile, Jack remained near the firing position, standing quietly with his hands resting at his sides. The fading sunlight caught the worn threads of the patch beneath his jacket. For a moment his fingers brushed against it again. The touch pulled him backward through time once more. The California hills disappeared. In their place rose a landscape of mist-covered ridges and endless clouds. He remembered cold mornings when visibility stretched only a few yards. He remembered long hours spent watching distant valleys through fog that never seemed to lift. Most of all, he remembered the men who had worn that same symbol. They had never been famous. Their names had never appeared in newspapers. They operated in places few people could locate on a map. Yet every one of them understood a simple promise. No matter how difficult the mission became, nobody would be left behind and nobody would be forgotten. Jack could still see them gathered beneath a weathered shelter late one evening. Rain tapped softly against the canvas overhead. A lantern swayed from a support beam, casting shadows across tired faces. One of the men unfolded a rough piece of cloth. Another produced thread and a needle from his pack. The patch had not been issued by any headquarters. No commander had approved it. It belonged entirely to them. Every stitch represented trust earned through hardship. Every line represented shared sacrifice. When the final version was finished, the oldest member of the group placed it into Jack's hands. "If any of us make it home," he had said quietly, "somebody needs to remember." Jack had nodded. Nobody made speeches after that. Nobody needed to. The silence carried more meaning than words ever could. The memory faded slowly as the years dissolved and the modern world returned. Back on the range, Hayes finally found what he had been searching for. A grainy historical photograph appeared on his screen. The image was decades old. Most people would have overlooked it. Hayes immediately froze. In the corner of the photograph stood 5 men beside a helicopter. Their faces were young. Their uniforms were worn. And on the shoulder of one man was the exact symbol hidden beneath Jack Callahan's jacket. Hayes zoomed in closer. His pulse jumped. Beneath the image was a short classification note indicating that the unit's activities remained largely undocumented. The names of most personnel had never been publicly released. Hayes stared at the screen in disbelief. Then he looked back toward the old veteran standing quietly among the Marines. For the first time all afternoon, he understood that this was no ordinary visitor. Without hesitation, he scrolled through his contacts, found the number for a senior operations officer he trusted, and pressed call. Across the range, Jack remained unaware of the chain reaction that had just begun. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. That was all it took. Hayes spoke quietly, careful not to attract attention, but the reaction on the other end of the line told him everything he needed to know. At first, the senior operations officer sounded skeptical. Then Hayes described the patch. Silence followed. Not confusion. Recognition. Hayes watched the color drain from his own reflection in the phone screen as the officer asked him to repeat the description twice. When the call ended, the only instruction he received was simple. Stay there. Do not let him leave. Back at the firing line, none of the other Marines knew what was happening. Their attention remained fixed on Jack Callahan. Sergeant Brooks had recovered enough of his confidence to force a grin. "Well," he said loudly, trying to reclaim control of the moment. "Looks like the old-timer got lucky." A few Marines laughed, though not nearly as enthusiastically as before. Brooks gestured toward the distant valley. "One good shot does not prove much." Jack looked toward the horizon. The evening wind had changed again. The flags nearest the firing positions pointed one direction, while the farthest flags drifted another. Thin ribbons of heat shimmer twisted above the rocky ground between them. Brooks followed his gaze. "What are you looking at?" Jack answered without turning. 3 different winds. Several Marines exchanged puzzled looks. Brooks folded his arms. "The weather station says 8 miles per hour." Jack nodded. "The weather station is standing here." The remark was not meant as an insult. That somehow made it hit harder. A few Marines glanced toward the valley again. Jack slowly pointed toward a ridgeline nearly 1,000 yards away. "The first wind is moving left to right." Then he pointed farther out. "The second is doing the opposite." His fingers shifted one final time toward a low depression near the target zone. "The third is rising." Brooks frowned. "You can see all that?" Jack looked at the distant landscape. "You can too. You are just looking at the equipment instead." The statement settled heavily over the group. Nobody laughed this time. The old veteran stepped closer to the observation scope mounted beside the firing lane. He adjusted it slightly and motioned for one of the younger Marines to look through it. Curious, the Marine obeyed. Seconds later, his expression changed. "The mirage," he said quietly. "It is moving differently out there." Another Marine stepped forward. Then another. Soon several were taking turns behind the scope. Each one saw what Jack had already noticed. Details hidden in plain sight. Patterns that software could not fully explain. Brooks remained silent. For the first time all afternoon, he was not looking at Jack as an elderly visitor. He was looking at him as a teacher. Nearby, Hayes slipped his phone back into his pocket. Across the base, vehicles were already beginning to move. Messages were being forwarded. Names were being checked. Old records were being opened. A chain of command was quietly waking up. Yet Jack seemed completely unaware of it. He stood beneath the fading sunlight, watching the range flags flutter against the evening sky. Calm, patient, unmoved by the attention around him. As the golden light settled across the valley, the Marines slowly realized something that made them even more uncomfortable than the impossible shots. The old man had not been trying to impress anyone. He had simply been telling them the truth. Hayes watched quietly as his message traveled up the chain. From his pocket, the phone vibrated briefly, a confirmation that the senior officer had understood and acted. Vehicles rolled quietly across the base. Personnel moved with purpose, yet none of the Marines on the range were aware of the unfolding recognition that would soon change everything. Jack remained still, rifle held lightly at his side, eyes scanning the distance, not in haste, not in urgency, merely observing the subtle movements of wind, light, and heat across the valley. Sergeant Brooks had stopped attempting jokes. His earlier confidence had evaporated into a tight awareness that something extraordinary was happening. The young Marines shifted uneasily. Even the ones who had laughed moments before found themselves caught in the gravity of the old veteran's presence. Jack took a slow, deliberate step forward. His hand rested on the stock of the rifle again, brushing against the worn grooves polished by decades of use. Every movement was measured, precise, almost ceremonial. The sunlight glinted on the steel targets, reflecting softly, drawing attention to the tiny imperfections that Jack noted without moving his eyes from the line of sight. Hayes glanced toward the distant ridgeline again. The patch had been identified. Historical archives confirmed it. The symbol belonged to a unit almost entirely undocumented, a team whose operations had remained classified decades ago. Hayes could feel the tension growing as he realized that Jack Callahan's actions and this patch together represented a direct link to a history that few alive had witnessed. Brooks noticed the intensity of Hayes's focus. The realization began to dawn. What they had assumed to be coincidence, luck, or luck tempered with skill was, in fact, decades of experience distilled into calm observation. Jack raised the rifle once more, checking the angle, the sight line, the wind. His posture was relaxed, almost casual. Yet every calculation had been performed in a fraction of a second. The younger Marines observed the subtle adjustments, the way his finger rested lightly on the trigger guard, the way his eyes read the flags fluttering in different directions. One by one, they stepped back slightly, giving him space, a respect unspoken but palpable in the shifting posture of their bodies. Hayes could barely contain his own anticipation. He knew what was coming next, but he remained quiet, letting the moment unfold naturally. The distant radio crackled faintly from the command center, a signal of the general's approach. Jack did not look toward it. He did not need to. Every muscle, every glance, every breath conveyed that he had been here before, that he understood the valley, the wind, the rifle, and the stakes better than anyone else in the area. Brooks clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of that presence pressing against his own authority. All around, Marines were becoming aware that the ordinary assumptions about age, skill, and relevance no longer applied. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant, waiting for the culmination of recognition that was about to arrive. Even as the vehicles approached, even as the general prepared to step onto the range, Jack Callahan remained calm, observant, and completely in control of the moment, a quiet force that drew every eye without demanding attention, a living bridge between decades of experience and the present, ready to transform the perspective of everyone watching. The first sign was not a siren. It was not flashing lights or shouted orders. It was silence on the radio network. Conversations that had been flowing across the range suddenly stopped as messages moved through channels most Marines never heard. Several range officers glanced toward the access road at the same time. A few seconds later, the low rumble of approaching vehicles drifted across the evening air. Heads turned instinctively. Sergeant Brooks looked toward the entrance and felt his stomach tighten. 3 black command vehicles rolled onto the range access road and came to a controlled stop near the observation area. Nobody spoke. The doors opened almost immediately. Senior officers stepped out first. A colonel, then another. Their pace was quick, focused, and completely devoid of ceremony. Marines standing nearby instinctively straightened their posture. The atmosphere changed in an instant. What had started as an ordinary afternoon at the range no longer felt ordinary at all. Hayes watched carefully. He recognized one of the officers from base headquarters. The man's expression alone confirmed everything. This was no routine visit. The colonel scanned the area until his eyes landed on Jack Callahan. The moment he saw the old veteran, he stopped walking. For a brief second, genuine surprise crossed his face. Then he continued forward. Not toward Brooks. Not toward the range officers. Toward Jack. The gathered Marines noticed it immediately. Jack remained exactly where he had been standing. Calm. Quiet. His weathered jacket shifted slightly in the evening breeze. The faded patch remained visible beneath the fold of the fabric. The colonel slowed as he approached. His eyes dropped to the insignia. Every trace of urgency disappeared from his face, replaced by something else. Respect. Deep and unmistakable respect. Brooks felt a chill move through him. He had spent the entire afternoon assuming he understood the man standing in front of him. Now he was no longer sure of anything. Before anyone could speak, another vehicle door opened. The entire range seemed to freeze. General Robert Whitmore stepped out. Conversations stopped completely. Even the wind felt quieter. Marines instinctively moved aside as the 4-star general began walking toward the firing line. There was no hesitation in his stride. No uncertainty. He knew exactly who he was looking for. Hayes watched the faces around him. Confusion spread through the younger Marines. Some had never seen a 4-star general in person. None of them had expected one to appear because of an elderly visitor at the rifle range. Yet General Whitmore ignored everyone else. He passed officers. He passed range personnel. He passed Sergeant Brooks without even looking in his direction. His attention remained fixed entirely on Jack Callahan. The distance between them slowly disappeared. 50 feet. 30 feet. 20. The fading sunlight painted long shadows across the concrete. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Jack looked up as the general approached. For the first time all afternoon, a faint expression crossed the old veteran's face. Not surprise. Recognition. As though he had seen this moment coming long before anyone else. General Whitmore stopped directly in front of him. His eyes settled on the worn patch beneath the jacket. The range held its breath. The colonels behind him remained silent. The Marines watched in complete disbelief. Then the general reached out slowly toward the faded insignia, his expression changing the instant he saw it clearly. In that moment, everyone present understood that the patch was far more than an old piece of fabric. It was a key to a story they had only begun to uncover. General Whitmore's hand stopped just short of the patch. For a moment, he simply stared at it, the fading threads illuminated by the last light of day. Then he looked up at Jack Callahan. The years seemed to disappear from his expression. What remained was the look of a man standing before a living piece of history. Nobody on the range moved. Nobody dared interrupt the silence. "I never thought I would see one of those again," the general said quietly. His voice carried across the firing line with surprising clarity. The Marines exchanged confused glances. The patch suddenly felt larger than the piece of fabric itself. It felt like a doorway into a world none of them understood. Jack offered a faint smile. "Most people do not." The general nodded slowly. "There were only a handful made." He looked toward the gathered Marines. "And almost nobody outside a very small circle knows what it represents." Sergeant Brooks felt every eye shift toward him. Earlier that afternoon, he had laughed at the old veteran. Now he stood frozen, listening to a four-star general speak about him with unmistakable respect. General Whitmore took a slow breath. "When I was a young officer, I heard stories about a team that operated in places nobody talked about. Their missions were rarely recorded. Their names rarely appeared anywhere. But among the people who knew, they became legends." His eyes returned to Jack. This man was one of them. A ripple of disbelief moved through the crowd. Hayes watched quietly. Everything he had discovered was being confirmed. The general stepped back and straightened his posture. Then, without hesitation, he raised his hand in a formal salute. The motion was crisp and immediate. Across the range, every Marine went completely still. For a second, nobody seemed able to process what they were seeing. A four-star general saluting the elderly man they had mocked only hours earlier. Jack looked at the general for a long moment before returning the salute. Simple, respectful, unforced. The silence that followed felt heavier than any speech. Sergeant Brooks lowered his gaze. The embarrassment was real, but it was accompanied by something else. Understanding. He finally saw the difference between confidence and experience, between skill and mastery, between wearing a uniform and truly carrying the weight of a lifetime of service. General Whitmore turned toward the Marines. "You spent today looking at his age," he said. "You should have been looking at his example." Nobody spoke. The evening breeze moved gently through the range flags. The steel targets in the distance reflected the final traces of sunlight. Jack adjusted his old jacket and glanced once more across the valley. The same calm expression remained on his face. He had never come there seeking recognition. He had never asked anyone to know his story. Yet somehow the truth had found its way into the open. One by one, Marines began standing a little straighter. Not because they had been ordered to, because they wanted to. The laughter from earlier felt very far away now. In its place stood quiet respect. As the sun slipped below the horizon, Jack Callahan started walking toward the exit. No dramatic farewell. No speech. Just the steady pace of a man who had already lived more than enough stories for one lifetime. The Marines watched him go until he disappeared beyond the range gate. Long after he was gone, nobody seemed eager to leave. They remained where they were, staring across the fading landscape, carrying with them a lesson they would remember for years. Some people never need to tell the world who they are. Their character speaks long before their name ever does.